In August 1914, an explorer named Sir Ernest Shackleton set out to attempt a journey that had never been tried. He wanted to cross the entire continent of Antarctica on foot, using the tools of the early 20th century. This was the plan: a 2,900-kilometer trek, starting at the Weddell Sea, passing through the South Pole, and ending at the Ross Sea. The crew expected to face temperatures as low as -50 degrees Celsius, but they never even made it to the coast. Before they could disembark, the Weddell Sea froze early, trapping their ship in a sea of solid ice. The ship, the Endurance, became a permanent fixture in the landscape. It was encased in a dense layer of pack ice, hundreds of miles from their destination. Then the Antarctic winter hit. For months, the crew lived in total darkness, as the shifting ice floes began to exert millions of tons of pressure against the hull. The wooden beams eventually started to buckle and snap. When the hull finally gave way, the water rushed in. The men had to move their supplies onto the frozen surface and watch as their ship was crushed and pulled under. The goal of crossing the continent was gone. Shackleton was now responsible for 28 men standing on a sheet of floating ice, with no radio and no way for the outside world to know they were still alive. They spent months living on a drifting ice floe they called Ocean Camp. They survived on strictly rationed food, while the wind and currents carried their frozen floor further away from land. When the ice began to soften and break, they had to act. The men harnessed themselves to 3 wooden lifeboats, each weighing a ton, and dragged them across the jagged ridges of the ice to reach open water. As their camp fractured, they launched the boats into the sea. For days, they navigated between massive, shifting icebergs that could have crushed the small wooden vessels at any moment. After 497 days without touching land, they finally reached Elephant Island. It was the first solid ground they had stood on since leaving society. But Elephant Island was a dead end. It was a barren rock that sought far outside any known shipping routes. If they stayed there, they would eventually run out of food and die. Shackleton decided to risk everything on one final trip. He took 5 men and a single lifeboat, planning to sail 1,300 kilometers to reach a whaling station on South Georgia Island. This meant crossing the Drake Passage. Because of its constant storms and massive swells, it is often cited as the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet. For 3 weeks, the 6 men lived in a boat that was constantly flooded by waves up to 12 meters high. They battled hurricane-force winds and freezing spray, while suffering from severe dehydration and exhaustion. They reached South Georgia, but a storm forced them to land on the uninhabited side of the island, the opposite side of the whaling station. To reach help, they had to cross a mountain range with peaks reaching 10,000 feet. No one had ever mapped these mountains, and the men had no climbing ropes or specialized gear. Shackleton and 2 others began a 36-hour non-stop march across the glaciers. They used a carpenter's tool to hack individual steps into the steep ice slopes to keep from falling into the crevasses. By the time they reached the other side, they had survived a crushed ship, the most violent ocean in the world, and a mountain range that was considered impassable. When they finally walked into the whaling station, they were unrecognizable. To the men living there, they looked like ghosts from an expedition that had been given up for dead 2 years earlier. Shackleton immediately turned his attention back to the sea. Over the next 4 months, he launched 4 separate rescue attempts, struggling to find a ship that could break through the heavy pack ice. On Elephant Island, Shackleton found every man still alive. For 4 months, Commander Frank Wild had kept the group focused, using overturned boats for shelter and hunting penguins to survive, until the rescue ship finally appeared on the horizon. After nearly 2 years of disaster, starvation, and extreme cold, the final count was impossible. 28 men were stranded, and 28 men returned home. In 2022, researchers found the wreck of the Endurance on the seafloor, 10,000 feet below the ice. Even after a century, the cold water had kept the ship almost perfectly intact. Shackleton's mission failed every geographical goal he had set, but because of his focus on the safety of his crew, he brought all 28 men home through conditions that should have been lethal.